The rain falls like whispers against the windows. Soft, persistent, hypnotic. It's the kind of rain that makes you want to close your eyes and drift away, surrendering to the rhythm of water against glass. But inside this building, inside the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris on this grey afternoon in 1887, nobody is drifting peacefully. In Ward 17, a woman sits perfectly still on a wooden chair. Her hands rest in her lap, folded as if in prayer, though her eyes suggest she's praying to nothing and no one. The doctors have a name for her condition. They call it melancholia. She calls it nothing because she hasn't spoken in 3 weeks. Her name in the ledger is simply Patient 247. This is where our story begins. But before we go any further, before we dive deep into centuries of darkness and discovery, I want you to get comfortable. Really comfortable. Because you're about to embark on a journey through time, through madness and medicine, through suffering and salvation. This is the complete history of depression, and it's going to take a while to tell. So adjust your pillow, pull up your blanket, let your breathing slow. And if you find yourself captivated by this story, if you want more deep dives into forgotten history, go ahead and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. We create these long-form stories specifically for moments like this, when your mind wants to wander but your body needs to rest. Hit that like button too. It helps us know you're out there, listening in the dark. Now, let's begin. Patient 247 hasn't eaten much today, or yesterday. The nurses have tried, bringing her thin soup and bread, but she just stares through them as if they're made of smoke. 3 weeks ago, she was brought here by her husband, a merchant who didn't know what else to do. She had stopped caring for their children, stopped eating, stopped speaking. Just sat in their parlor, staring at nothing, tears occasionally rolling down her cheeks for no reason he could understand. The doctors examined her. No fever, no visible injuries, no signs of physical illness, but something was clearly terribly wrong, so they admitted her, gave her a number, took away her clothes and gave her a grey institutional dress. And now she sits in Ward 17, one of dozens of women who have lost themselves to this mysterious affliction. Patient 247 is not alone in history, not by a long shot. To understand her, to understand what's happening in her mind and why the doctors don't know how to help her, we need to go back. Way back, we need to understand how human beings have thought about depression across thousands of years. Because here's the thing, depression isn't new, it's been with us since the beginning. What's changed is how we understand it, how we talk about it, and how we try to treat it. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're in ancient Greece, around 400 BCE. The Parthenon is still new gleaming white marble on the Acropolis. Socrates is walking the streets of Athens, asking annoying questions. And in a clinic somewhere in the city, a physician named Hippocrates is examining a patient who sounds remarkably like patient 247. This patient is despondent, can't sleep, has no appetite, sees no joy in anything. Hippocrates, the man who would become known as the father of medicine, has a theory about what's wrong. He believes the human body contains 4 essential fluids, 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humors are in balance, you're healthy. When they're out of balance, you get sick. And this patient with his darkness and despair clearly has too much black bile. Melancholia, black bile. The word itself sounds dark, doesn't it? Like something thick and heavy, weighing you down, pulling you into darkness. Hippocrates writes about it carefully, documenting the symptoms. They are averse to food, despondent, sleepless, irritable, and restless. Here's what's fascinating about Hippocrates. He was wrong about the cause, but he was right about something crucial. He recognized that this wasn't punishment from the gods. It wasn't demon possession. It wasn't a moral failing. It was a medical condition, something happening in the body itself. This was revolutionary. In an age when most people attributed illness to divine displeasure or supernatural forces, Hippocrates said, "No, this is physical. We can observe it. We can study it. We can treat it." And they tried. Oh, how they tried. The treatments were based on their understanding of the humors, so they focused on removing the excess black bile. They used purging, inducing vomiting and diarrhea to cleanse the system. They used bloodletting, making small cuts to drain away the bad blood. They prescribed changes in diet, especially foods that were believed to be cooling and drying to counteract the wet, cold nature of black bile. They recommended exercise, fresh air, bathing in mineral springs. And here's something remarkable. They also prescribed what they called gentle conversation therapy. Even back then, 2400 years ago, they knew that talking helped. A Roman physician named Galen, living several centuries after Hippocrates, expanded on these ideas. Galen was obsessive about documentation. He wrote hundreds of texts, performed countless dissections, and developed elaborate theories about how the body worked. For melancholia, he identified 3 types: one that affected the brain directly, one that affected the whole body, and one that originated in the digestive system and spread upward. He was, in a weird way, kind of onto something. Modern research has shown connections between gut health and depression, between physical illness and mental illness. Galen didn't have the science, but he had keen observation skills. He watched his patients. He noted patterns. He tried to make sense of what he saw. The ancient world, for all its limitations, at least tried to understand depression as a medical phenomenon. But then came the Middle Ages and things got dark. Really dark. Like a candle snuffed out in a windowless room, leaving nothing but absolute darkness pressing against your skin. The Catholic Church dominated European thought during the medieval period, and their interpretation of mental illness was vastly different from the Greeks and Romans. If you were depressed, you were either being punished by God for your sins, or you were being tormented by demons. The treatment, prayer, fasting, exorcism. If you were lucky, you might be sent to a monastery where monks would pray over you, if you were unlucky. Well, let's just say that being burned at the stake for witchcraft was not unheard of for people who behaved strangely. Some monks wrote about something they called acedia, a spiritual apathy or sloth that sounds remarkably like depression. It was considered one of the 8 deadly sins. Yeah, there used to be 8 before they streamlined it to 7. Acedia was this creeping despair, this inability to care about anything, even your own salvation. Monks struggling with acedia were supposed to overcome it through prayer, through manual labor, through religious devotion. It was seen as a spiritual battle, a test of faith. If you couldn't overcome it, well, that was your fault for being spiritually weak. But here's an interesting wrinkle. While Europe was stuck in this dark age of understanding mental illness, scholars in the Islamic world were continuing the Greco-Roman tradition. Physicians like Avicenna, the Persian polymath working around 1025 CE, wrote extensively about mental illness in his canon of medicine. He recommended music therapy. He prescribed occupational therapy, keeping patients busy with meaningful activities. He even advocated for what we'd now call counseling or psychotherapy. While European Christians were exorcising demons, Islamic physicians were developing treatment approaches that wouldn't look completely out of place in a modern psychiatric hospital. Let that sink in as you drift. 2 different worlds, 2 completely different approaches to the same human suffering. One saw demons, the other saw illness. One used prayer and punishment, the other used medicine and compassion. History isn't a straight line of progress. It zigs and zags, moves forward in some places while moving backward in others. If you were depressed in medieval Europe, you were pretty much screwed. Sorry to be blunt, but it's true. There were exceptions. Wealthy people might receive relatively humane care, and some monastic communities were genuinely compassionate. But for most people, depression meant isolation, suffering, maybe death. Nobody understood it. Nobody could treat it. It was just this crushing weight you had to carry alone until it either lifted or killed you. The Renaissance brought changes, though not always for the better. As Europe began pulling itself out of the medieval mindset, there was renewed interest in classical learning, including ancient medical texts. Physicians started reading Hippocrates and Galen again. Universities were founded. Scientific inquiry became respectable again, though the church still kept a tight leash on what could be studied and how. In 1621, an English scholar named Robert Burton published a massive book called The Anatomy of Melancholy. This thing was huge, over 1,000 pages in modern editions, and it examined depression from every conceivable angle: medical, social, philosophical, even astrological. Burton himself suffered from depression, and his book reads like a desperate attempt to understand his own condition. It's rambling, digressive, packed with quotations from ancient authors and observations from his own life, but it's also deeply, painfully human. Burton wrote about the contradictions of depression, the paradoxes that anyone who's experienced it would recognize. They are weary of their lives, he wrote, and yet afraid of death. Think about that for a moment. Let it really sink in. In 1621, Robert Burton captured the essential paradox of severe depression in a single sentence: the simultaneous desire for escape and the terror of that escape. The way depression makes you want to stop existing, but also makes you terrified of not existing. It's a feeling that millions of people still experience today, over 400 years later. Nothing has changed in that fundamental experience. The darkness feels the same. Burton couldn't cure depression. He didn't even really understand what caused it, but he could describe it with painful accuracy. He could bear witness to his own suffering and the suffering of others, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just knowing that someone else understands, that you're not alone in this darkness, makes it a tiny bit more bearable. The 17th and 18th centuries brought the Age of Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, science, observation, experimentation. Surely, you'd think, this would lead to better treatment for people with depression. Surely the Age of Reason would bring rational, humane approaches to mental illness. Well, yes and no, mostly no, to be honest. This was the era when the asylum system really took off. Now, asylums weren't entirely new. There had been institutions for the mentally ill before. The Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, known colloquially as Bedlam, had been around since the 1400s. But the 18th and 19th centuries saw an explosion in the number and size of these institutions. The theory was actually kind of reasonable on the surface. Remove people from the stresses and chaos of everyday life, place them in calm, controlled environments, provide regular routines and medical care, and they'd recover. It was called moral treatment, and it sounds nice, doesn't it? Moral treatment, humane care. The reality was often horrific. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1800. You're a woman living in England and you've been dealing with what we would now recognize as major depressive disorder. You can barely get out of bed in the morning. Everything feels heavy, like you're moving through water. You've lost interest in everything that used to bring you joy. Your children, your friends, your hobbies, everything. You cry for hours for no reason you can explain. Your husband, not knowing what else to do and probably embarrassed by your behavior, has you committed to an asylum. You arrive at a massive stone building, grey and imposing, surrounded by high walls. The first thing you notice is the smell. It hits you like a physical force, unwashed bodies, human waste, something else you can't quite identify, but that makes your stomach turn. You're taken through a series of locked doors, each one clanging shut behind you with a finality that makes your heart sink. You're brought to a ward where dozens of other women are kept. Some are screaming. Some are catatonic, staring at walls with empty eyes. Some are restrained in straitjackets or chained to their beds to prevent them from hurting themselves or others. The treatments, let's talk about the treatments. Bloodletting, of course, that old standby from ancient times, still going strong. The doctors believed that mental illness was caused by too much blood putting pressure on the brain, so they'd cut your arm or apply leeches to drain away the excess. You'd sit there, watching your blood drip into a bowl, getting weaker and weaker, and the doctors would nod approvingly, convinced they were helping you. Then there was purging. They'd give you substances that made you vomit violently or have explosive diarrhea, sometimes both at once. The theory was that this would cleanse your system of the bad humors causing your illness. The reality was that it left you dehydrated, weak, and miserable. But hey, at least you were too exhausted to be depressed, right? That's not really how it works, but that was the logic. Hydrotherapy sounds relaxing, doesn't it? Like a nice bath or a spa treatment. Yeah, no, asylum hydrotherapy was terrifying. They'd strap you into a special chair and alternate between dumping ice-cold water and boiling hot water over your body. Or they'd wrap you in cold, wet sheets and leave you for hours. Or they'd hold you underwater until you nearly drowned. The shock was supposed to jolt you back to sanity, reset your brain somehow. The reality was that it was torture, plain and simple. Some doctors used spinning chairs. I'm not kidding. They'd strap you into a chair mounted on a rotating platform and spin you at high speeds until you vomited or lost consciousness. The theory was that this would redistribute the blood flow in your brain, somehow restoring balance. The reality was that it was a nightmare, a disorienting, nausea-inducing nightmare that left you weak and confused. And here's the really messed up part, the part that should make you uncomfortable as you're drifting off to sleep. The doctors genuinely believed they were helping. Most of them weren't sadists who enjoyed torturing people. They were working with the best understanding they had at the time. The problem was that their understanding was completely, utterly wrong. They were treating symptoms they didn't understand with methods that had no scientific basis, inflicting suffering in the name of healing. The conditions in these asylums varied wildly. Some were run by reformers who genuinely wanted to help their patients. Places like the York Retreat in England, founded by Quakers in 1796, implemented what they called moral treatment, treating patients with kindness and dignity, providing them with meaningful work and activities, creating a therapeutic environment. And you know what? It actually worked to a degree. Patients treated with kindness and respect often showed improvement. Revolutionary concept, right? Treat people like human beings and they do better. But these enlightened asylums were the exception, not the rule. Most were overcrowded, understaffed, underfunded hellholes where patients were warehoused rather than treated. If you were poor, forget about it. You'd be lucky to have a bed to yourself. More likely, you'd be sleeping on a straw mat on a cold floor, surrounded by people in various states of mental distress, with little to no actual medical care. The wealthy could afford private asylums with better conditions, but even those weren't exactly therapeutic. If you're still awake, still listening, I want you to think about something. Think about how terrifying it must have been to be patient 247, or someone like her, in an era when nobody understood what was wrong with you. You're trapped in this darkness, this crushing despair, and the people who are supposed to help you are making it worse. They're draining your blood, they're making you sick with purges, they're spinning you until you pass out. And all the while, they're telling you it's for your own good, that you need to cooperate, that resistance means you're not trying to get better. The 19th century progressed, and the asylums just kept getting bigger. In the United States, a reformer named Dorothea Dix campaigned tirelessly for better treatment of the mentally ill. She visited jails and almshouses where mentally ill people were kept in cages, in cellars, chained to walls. She documented these horrors and presented them to state legislatures, arguing that mentally ill people deserved better. Her efforts led to the construction of numerous state psychiatric hospitals across the country. These hospitals were built with good intentions. They were designed to be therapeutic environments where patients could recover in peace and dignity, surrounded by nature and given meaningful work to do. The Kirkbride Plan, developed by psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride, called for hospitals to be built in pastoral settings with extensive grounds, with architecture designed to be uplifting and therapeutic. High ceilings, lots of natural light. Views of gardens and countryside. But good intentions don't always translate to good outcomes. As more and more people were committed to these hospitals, as states realized they could save money by centralizing care, the institutions became overwhelmed. Therapeutic environments became warehouses. Recovery became indefinite detention. The beautiful Kirkbride buildings, designed for maybe 200 or 300 patients, were housing thousands. Hallways became sleeping areas. Basements became wards. The gardens were neglected. The therapy programs were abandoned. All that remained was custody, keeping people locked up and out of sight. And here's something that'll keep you thinking as you drift off. In the 1800s, you could be committed to an asylum for almost anything. Masturbation, asylum. Reading too many novels if you were a woman, asylum. Being too independent, too outspoken, too anything that your family didn't approve of, asylum. Depression, definitely asylum. And once you were in, getting out was nearly impossible. Your family had to petition for your release, assuming they wanted you back. Many patients spent decades in these institutions, their lives slowly ebbing away behind locked doors and barred windows, forgotten by the world outside. There are records from these asylums, patient records that survive in archives, and reading them is heartbreaking. People admitted for relatively minor issues, grief after losing a child, postpartum depression, stress from poverty, who never left, who died in these institutions decades later, having spent most of their lives locked up for the crime of being sad at the wrong time. But surely, you're thinking, surely medical science was advancing. Surely doctors were starting to understand what depression actually was. Well, kind of, sort of, not really. The late 19th century saw the emergence of neurology and psychiatry as distinct medical specialties. Doctors began to seriously study mental illness using scientific methods. They examined the brains of deceased patients, looking for physical abnormalities. They documented symptoms in meticulous detail. They developed classification systems for different types of mental illness, trying to bring order to the chaos of human madness. One of the most influential figures of this era was Emil Kraepelin, a German psychiatrist who created a comprehensive classification system for mental disorders in the 1890s. Kraepelin was obsessive about observation and documentation. He followed patients for years, decades even, tracking how their symptoms evolved over time. He distinguished between what he called manic depressive insanity, what we now call bipolar disorder, and dementia praecox, what we now call schizophrenia. For depression that wasn't part of manic depressive illness, he used terms like involutional melancholia, believing it was related to the aging process and hormonal changes. Kraepelin's work was groundbreaking in that it treated mental illness as something that could be systematically studied and categorized. He brought scientific rigor to psychiatry, but, and this is important, he still didn't really understand what caused depression or how to treat it effectively. He could describe it, he could classify it, he could predict its course with some accuracy, but he couldn't cure it. Meanwhile, across Europe, a young neurologist in Vienna was developing ideas that would revolutionize how we think about the mind. His name was Sigmund Freud, and love him or hate him, and there's plenty of reason for both, he changed everything. Freud started as a neurologist studying the physical structures of the brain, but he became increasingly interested in the psychological, in the subjective experience of his patients. He developed a method called psychoanalysis, where patients would lie on a couch and talk about whatever came to mind while he listened and interpreted the hidden meanings behind their words. Free association, he called it. Say whatever pops into your head, no matter how random or embarrassing, and we'll figure out what your unconscious mind is trying to tell us. For depression, melancholia, as he still called it, Freud had a theory. He believed it was anger turned inward. When we lose something or someone important to us, we unconsciously identify with that lost object. We take it into ourselves psychologically. Then when we feel anger about the loss, we can't direct it at the lost object because it's now part of us. So we direct the anger at ourselves. This self-directed anger manifests as depression, as self-criticism, as the feeling that we're worthless and bad. It's actually a pretty interesting theory, and there's probably some truth to it in some cases. But Freud, being Freud, took it way too far. Everything became about unconscious conflicts, repressed desires, usually with a sexual component because Freud was obsessed with sex. Your depression isn't just about anger turned inward. It's about unresolved Oedipal feelings, castration anxiety, penis envy, all sorts of wild interpretations that seem absurd today. But here's the thing about Freud. He was one of the first to really take the subjective experience of the patient seriously. He listened. For hours and hours, sometimes years, he listened to his patients talk about their thoughts, their feelings, their dreams, their memories. He believed that understanding a person's inner world, their mental life, was crucial to helping them. That was actually kind of radical at the time, when most doctors just observed external symptoms and prescribed physical treatments. Psychoanalysis became hugely popular in the early 20th century, especially among the wealthy who could afford the many years of multiple sessions per week treatment. Freud's ideas spread through Europe and America. Everyone was reading him, arguing about him, either embracing his theories or rejecting them. He became a celebrity, the most famous psychiatrist in the world. But for the average person suffering from depression, psychoanalysis remained completely out of reach. It was expensive. It was time-consuming. It required the kind of educated, introspective patient who could engage in deep psychological exploration. Most people with depression still ended up in those overcrowded state hospitals, receiving minimal care, maybe some sedatives to keep them calm, but nothing that actually addressed their depression. And speaking of those state hospitals, let's talk about what was happening there in the early 20th century, because things are about to get even more disturbing. If you thought bloodletting and spinning chairs were bad, just wait. The 20th century brought new scientific knowledge, new medical techniques, and new horrors inflicted in the name of treatment. Take a slow breath, let your muscles relax. We're about to dive into some of the darkest chapters in the history of psychiatry. And if you're finding this journey fascinating, if these stories are keeping you engaged even as you're drifting towards sleep, do me a favor and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. Hit that like button, leave a comment. Your engagement tells us you want more content like this, more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history, more stories told in this calm, measured way that's perfect for late-night listening. All right, let's continue. In 1917, an Austrian psychiatrist named Julius Wagner-Jauregg noticed something strange. He was treating patients with neurosyphilis, a late-stage complication of syphilis that caused severe psychiatric symptoms. Some of these patients developed high fevers from other infections, and Wagner-Jauregg noticed that their psychiatric symptoms seemed to improve after the fever broke. So he had an idea. What if he deliberately induced fevers in mentally ill patients? Would that help them? He started infecting patients with malaria. Yes, you read that right. Malaria. He would take blood from a malaria patient and inject it into a psychiatric patient, giving them malaria on purpose. They would develop high fevers, become extremely ill, nearly die, and then, if they survived, Wagner-Jauregg would treat the malaria with quinine. And you know what? Some of the patients did seem to improve. Their psychiatric symptoms lessened. Some even recovered enough to leave the hospital. For this work, Julius Wagner-Jauregg won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1927. Let that sink in for a moment. A Nobel Prize for deliberately infecting mentally ill people with a potentially fatal disease. The logic was that the benefit outweighed the risk, that these patients were suffering so terribly that almost any intervention was justified if it might help. But still, malaria. The thing is, it did actually help some patients, though probably not for the reasons Wagner-Jauregg thought. The fevers did something to brain chemistry. Or maybe the immune response triggered by the infection had effects on neurotransmitters. Or maybe there was a psychological component. Surviving something dramatic gave patients hope and a sense of having overcome something. We'll never really know because the treatment was abandoned once better options became available. But malaria therapy opened the door to a whole new approach, deliberately inducing trauma or shock to treat mental illness. And doctors ran with that idea. Oh boy, did they ever. In the 1930s, a Hungarian psychiatrist named Ladislas Meduna started inducing seizures in patients using camphor and later a drug called metrazole. His theory was based on a mistaken observation. He believed that schizophrenia and epilepsy never occurred in the same person. Therefore, he reasoned, inducing seizures might cure schizophrenia. When that didn't work out, doctors started trying it for depression and other conditions. Imagine this for a moment. Really put yourself there. You're strapped to a bed. A doctor approaches with a syringe. He injects you with metrazole. Within seconds, you feel an overwhelming sense of doom, terror like you've never experienced. Your heart is racing. You can't breathe. You know something terrible is about to happen. Then the seizure hits. Your entire body convulses violently. Your muscles contract so hard they sometimes break your own bones. Fractures of the spine, the shoulders, the legs. When it's over, when you finally regain consciousness, you're confused, in pain, terrified. And the doctors tell you this is treatment. This is helping you. This is making you better. Patients who underwent metrazole therapy described it as the most terrifying experience of their lives. The few seconds between injection and seizure were filled with what they called annihilation terror, a sense that they were about to die or cease to exist. Many refused further treatment, but in psychiatric hospitals, patients didn't get to refuse. If the doctors thought you needed treatment, you got treatment, whether you wanted it or not. In 1938, two Italian psychiatrists, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, developed something they thought would be better: electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. Instead of using chemicals to induce seizures, they used electricity. The first patient was a man found wandering the streets of Rome, speaking gibberish, probably suffering from schizophrenia. The police brought him to Cerletti's clinic. Cerletti and Bini strapped electrodes to his head and sent an electrical current through his brain. He seized. He survived. They did it again and again, over several sessions. Did it help? Accounts vary, but Cerletti and Bini published their results, and ECT spread around the world with remarkable speed. Within a few years, psychiatric hospitals everywhere were using it. It became the go-to treatment for severe depression, and here's the wild, complicated part: it actually worked for many people. Despite its horrific reputation, despite the memory loss and confusion it caused, despite the fact that nobody really understood why it worked, ECT did seem to pull some people out of severe depression when nothing else could. They still use ECT today, by the way. It's much more refined now. Modern ECT uses anesthesia so you're unconscious during the procedure. They give you muscle relaxants so you don't actually convulse violently. They use carefully calibrated electrical currents delivered to specific parts of the brain. It's nothing like those early brutal sessions, and it remains one of the most effective treatments for severe, treatment-resistant depression. But back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, it was rough. Really, really rough. Patients would be held down by multiple staff members. Electrodes would be placed on their temples or forehead. The shock would be delivered with no anesthesia, no muscle relaxants. Their bodies would arch and convulse. Sometimes they'd bite through their tongues. Sometimes they'd break bones. They'd wake up confused, unable to remember where they were or what had happened. The memory loss was significant, sometimes permanent. People would forget months or years of their lives. And yet some of them got better. Some of them walked out of the hospital, returned to their lives, functioned again. So the treatment continued, despite its brutality, because it was the only thing that seemed to work for certain patients. But ECT wasn't even the most invasive treatment doctors came up with. Not even close. We need to talk about lobotomy, and I want you to really hear this, really understand what happened, because it's one of the darkest chapters in medical history. In 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz performed the first lobotomy. He was inspired by research suggesting that the frontal lobes of the brain were involved in emotional responses. His logic was straightforward. If the frontal lobes are generating negative emotions, and those emotions are causing suffering, why not cut the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain? Remove the source of the problem. His first lobotomies involved drilling holes in patients' skulls and injecting ethanol to destroy brain tissue. Later, he developed a surgical tool called a leucotome, basically an ice pick-like instrument that could be inserted into the brain to sever neural connections. He performed the surgery on patients with severe mental illness, schizophrenia, severe depression, debilitating anxiety, people for whom nothing else had worked, who were suffering terribly. Some of them did improve after the surgery. They became calmer, less agitated, less tormented by their symptoms, but they also became less emotional, less creative, less engaged with life. Their personalities were fundamentally altered, flattened somehow, but Moniz considered the surgery a success and he published his results. Then an American neurologist named Walter Freeman got involved, and things got so much worse. Freeman was a showman, a self-promoter, ambitious and convinced he could save the world with this procedure. But he was also a neurologist, not a surgeon, and he wanted a lobotomy procedure that didn't require an operating room or another doctor to perform. So he developed what became known as the transorbital lobotomy, the ice pick lobotomy. Here's how it worked. The patient would be knocked unconscious using electroconvulsive shock. Then Freeman would take an actual ice pick, literally an ice pick from his kitchen drawer at first, insert it above the eyeball, between the eye and the upper eyelid. He'd tap it through the thin bone there with a hammer. Once it was through the bone and into the brain, he'd move it back and forth, up and down, severing the connections in the frontal lobes. The whole thing took about 10 minutes. No operating room needed. No anesthesia beyond the initial shock. Barely any bleeding. Freeman performed thousands of these procedures. Thousands. He traveled around the country in a van he called the lobotomobile, going from hospital to hospital, institution to institution, performing lobotomies assembly line style. Sometimes he'd do 20 or more in a single day. He even performed the procedure in hotel rooms and his office. He once lost an ice pick in a patient's brain and had to use a second one to finish the job. One of his patients was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy. She had mild intellectual disability and mood swings, and her father Joseph Kennedy, worried about her behavior and how it might affect his son's political careers, authorized a lobotomy when she was 23 years old. Freeman performed the procedure in 1941. Rosemary went unable to walk, talk, and care for herself. She came out with the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to speak coherently or control her body, requiring constant care for the rest of her life. She lived until 2005, spending most of those decades in institutions, destroyed by a procedure that was supposed to help her. And Freeman, he kept performing lobotomies into the 1960s, kept insisting the procedure was effective and humane, even as the evidence of its devastating effects mounted. He was finally stopped only after one of his patients died when an ice pick he was using broke off in her brain and he had to retrieve it. Even then, he never admitted he'd done anything wrong. The thing about lobotomies is that they did change behavior. Agitated patients became calm. Depressed patients sometimes showed reduced symptoms of depression. But at what cost? They lost the ability to feel deeply. They lost their drive, their ambition, their creativity, their complex emotional responses. They lost essential parts of what made them themselves. The surgery didn't cure mental illness. It disabled the parts of the brain that generated complex thought and emotion. It was a cure worse than the disease. And yet, and this is the part that should really disturb you, Antonio Egas Moniz won the Nobel Prize for developing the lobotomy in 1949, the same year that George Orwell published, 1984, with its warnings about totalitarian control and the destruction of individual thought. The medical establishment was honoring a procedure that literally destroyed people's ability to think and feel fully. By the 1950s, over 40,000 lobotomies had been performed in the United States alone, thousands more in Europe and other countries. Most of the patients were in psychiatric hospitals, people who couldn't advocate for themselves, who couldn't refuse treatment. Many were women, including women who were considered too emotional, too difficult, too independent. There are documented cases of women lobotomized for postpartum depression, for being too sexually active, for complaining too much about their marriages. The procedure was used as a tool of control as much as a tool of treatment. But you're probably wondering, how did we go from jamming ice picks into people's brains to Prozac and modern psychiatry? What changed? The answer is chemistry. The discovery that depression could be treated with chemicals, with medication, changed everything. And like so many medical breakthroughs, it happened partly by accident. Let your breathing slow. Let your body sink deeper into your bed. We're about to enter a different era now, an era that's closer to our own, where science begins to catch up with suffering, where treatment becomes less about punishment and more about healing. But don't get too comfortable, because this story still has plenty of darkness ahead. The year is 1951. At the Seaview Hospital on Staten Island, New York, doctors are testing a new drug for tuberculosis. TB is still a major killer at this point, and they're desperate for effective treatments. This drug, called isoniazid, seems promising. It's killing the tuberculosis bacteria, but the doctors notice something weird, something they didn't expect. Their patients are happy, like really happy. Some are dancing in the hallways. Some are laughing and joking with the staff. This is strange because TB patients are usually pretty miserable. They're seriously ill, isolated in sanitariums, often dying. They shouldn't be this cheerful. The doctors realize that the drug must be affecting mood somehow, doing something to the brain beyond just treating the TB infection. Around the same time, another drug called iproniazid is being tested for TB, and it's having similar mood-elevating effects. Researchers start investigating what these drugs are actually doing in the brain. They discover that these drugs inhibit an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which breaks down neurotransmitters like serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. By blocking this enzyme, the drugs allow these mood-regulating chemicals to build up in the brain. More serotonin, more norepinephrine, more dopamine, and apparently more happiness. Thus, the first antidepressants were born. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs. They weren't perfect. They had serious side effects, including dangerous interactions with certain foods containing tyramine, aged cheese, red wine, cured meats, that could cause life-threatening spikes in blood pressure. But for the first time in human history, there was a pill that could actually treat depression by altering brain chemistry. Not by shocking the brain, not by cutting it, not by spinning you in a chair or draining your blood. Just a pill that changed the chemistry and lifted the darkness. In 1957, another accidental discovery. A Swiss pharmaceutical company was testing a drug called imipramine as a potential treatment for schizophrenia. It didn't work for schizophrenia, but it worked really well for depression. Researcher Roland Kuhn noticed that depressed patients who took the drug showed remarkable improvement. They became more energetic, more engaged, more able to experience pleasure and joy. Kuhn figured out that imipramine worked differently from the MAOIs. Instead of inhibiting the breakdown of neurotransmitters, it blocked their reuptake, prevented the brain from reabsorbing serotonin and norepinephrine after they'd been released. This meant the neurotransmitters stayed active in the synapses longer, enhancing their effects. This was the first tricyclic antidepressant, named for its three-ring chemical structure. Suddenly, psychiatry had tools that actually worked. Not perfectly, not for everyone, and with plenty of side effects: dry mouth, constipation, weight gain, sedation, sexual dysfunction. But they worked. They pulled people out of the darkness. They gave people their lives back. This was revolutionary. If depression could be treated with medication, that meant it was a medical condition, a chemical problem in the brain, not a moral failing or a weakness of character. It was a disease, like diabetes or hypertension. You wouldn't tell a diabetic to just try harder to produce insulin, would you? So why tell a depressed person to just cheer up and think positive? They had a chemical imbalance that needed correction, and now we had medications that could provide that correction. The chemical imbalance theory of depression took hold in the 1960s and 70s. It became the dominant paradigm for understanding depression. Your brain doesn't have enough serotonin or norepinephrine, so you feel depressed. Take medication that increases those neurotransmitters and you'll feel better. It was elegant, it was simple, it made sense. Now we should note that this theory has been heavily debated in recent decades and is now considered an oversimplification. Depression is way more complex than just not enough serotonin. It involves multiple neurotransmitter systems, brain structure differences, inflammation, genetics, stress responses, and countless other factors. But at the time, the chemical imbalance theory was useful. It helped doctors and patients understand what was happening. It reduced stigma by framing depression as a medical condition rather than a personal failing. The medications kept improving throughout the 1970s and 80s. More tricyclics were developed, different MAOIs with different side effect profiles. Researchers were learning more about brain chemistry, mapping out neural pathways, understanding how different neurotransmitters affected mood and behavior. Then came 1987, the year that changed everything. The year the FDA approved fluoxetine, better known by its brand name, Prozac. Prozac was different from earlier antidepressants. It was a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRI. It specifically targeted serotonin without affecting other neurotransmitters as much, which meant fewer side effects compared to the older drugs. You didn't gain tons of weight like you often did with tricyclics. You didn't have to follow a restricted diet like you did with MAOIs. It was relatively safe even if you took too much, unlike tricyclics, which could kill you with an overdose. And for many people, it worked just as well as the older drugs. Prozac became a cultural phenomenon. By 1990, it was on the cover of Newsweek magazine with the headline, "A Breakthrough Drug for Depression." Time magazine, the New York Times, everyone was writing about it. Doctors were prescribing it not just for depression, but for anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, everything. The manufacturer, Eli Lilly, was making billions of dollars. Prozac became the most prescribed antidepressant in the world. There was backlash, of course. Critics argued that we were medicalizing normal human emotions, that we were creating a society where everyone needed pills to cope with life's ordinary difficulties. Psychiatrist Peter Kramer wrote a book called Listening to Prozac that raised fascinating questions about whether these drugs were treating illness or enhancing personality. He described patients who didn't just get better on Prozac, they became better than well, more confident, more outgoing, more successful than they'd ever been. If a pill could fundamentally change your personality, what did that mean for our understanding of self? Elizabeth Wurtzel published her memoir Prozac Nation in 1994, describing her experience with severe depression and her complicated relationship with Prozac and other medications. The book became a bestseller and helped normalize conversations about mental illness and treatment, especially among younger people. Here was this young, smart, articulate woman talking openly about wanting to die, about not being able to get out of bed, about trying multiple medications and therapies, about the messiness and difficulty of living with depression. It resonated with millions of people who recognized their own experiences in her words. But here's the complicated part, the part that's important to understand as you're drifting off. Prozac and other SSRIs really did help a lot of people. For people with severe depression who had tried everything else, SSRIs were often life-changing. They weren't perfect. They didn't work for everyone. Some people experienced no benefit, others had intolerable side effects. Some found that the drugs worked initially but then stopped working after months or years. But for many people, SSRIs were the difference between barely surviving and actually living, between going through the motions and actually experiencing joy. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw more SSRIs hit the market: Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, Lexapro. There were also SNRIs, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors like Effexor and Cymbalta, which targeted both serotonin and norepinephrine. Wellbutrin offered a different mechanism, affecting dopamine and norepinephrine instead of serotonin. Remeron worked on different receptor subtypes. Suddenly, psychiatrists had options. If one drug didn't work, they could try another. They could combine medications. They could adjust doses. It was trial and error, sure, playing chemical roulette with people's brain chemistry, but at least there were trials to conduct. At least there was hope. While all this pharmaceutical development was happening, psychotherapy was also evolving. Freudian psychoanalysis had largely fallen out of favor for treating depression. It took too long, cost too much, and honestly didn't work that well for most people. Lying on a couch talking about your mother for 5 years might provide interesting insights, but it often didn't relieve depression symptoms. New therapies emerged that were more focused, more practical, more evidence-based. Aaron Beck, a psychiatrist working in the 1960s, developed cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Beck had been trained as a psychoanalyst, but he noticed that his depressed patients had systematic biases in how they thought. They catastrophized, assumed the worst possible outcome. They personalized, took everything as a personal attack or failure. They overgeneralized. One bad experience meant everything was bad. They engaged in black and white thinking. Things were either perfect or terrible with no middle ground. Beck realized that these thought patterns weren't just symptoms of depression. They were maintaining and worsening the depression. Your thoughts influence your emotions, and your emotions influence your behavior, and your behavior influences your thoughts. It's a cycle. So if you could interrupt that cycle by changing the thoughts, you might be able to change the emotions and behaviors too. CBT teaches patients to identify their negative automatic thoughts, examine the evidence for and against those thoughts, and develop more balanced, realistic ways of thinking. It's practical, structured, typically short-term, 12 to 20 sessions rather than years. And you know what? It works. Numerous studies have shown that CBT is as effective as medication for mild to moderate depression, and combining CBT with medication is more effective than either treatment alone. Other therapies emerged too. Interpersonal therapy focused on improving relationships and communication patterns. Dialectical behavior therapy, developed by Marsha Linehan for borderline personality disorder, proved helpful for depression with emotional dysregulation. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy combined meditation practices with CBT techniques. Acceptance and commitment therapy focused on accepting difficult emotions rather than fighting them. The late 20th century also saw mental illness emerge from the shadows culturally. Public figures started talking openly about their struggles. Mike Wallace, the legendary 60 Minutes journalist, spoke about his severe depression and hospitalization. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin wrote about his depression and alcoholism after walking on the moon. Turned out that being the second man on the moon and then coming back to regular life was kind of depressing. Writer William Styron published Darkness Visible in 1990, a harrowing account of his descent into suicidal depression and his slow, difficult recovery. It became a bestseller and is still considered one of the best descriptions of severe depression ever written. These stories mattered. They helped reduce stigma. They showed that depression could affect anyone, the successful, the accomplished, the intelligent, the famous. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't failure. It was illness, and it could happen to anyone, regardless of how great their life looked from the outside. But despite all this progress, the medications, the therapies, the public awareness, the reduced stigma, depression remained stubbornly difficult to treat for many people. About a third of patients didn't respond to first-line treatments. Treatment-resistant depression became a major focus of research. What do you do when someone has tried multiple medications, tried therapy, tried combinations, and nothing works? When they're still suffering, still unable to function, still contemplating suicide? This brings us to some of the stranger, more controversial aspects of modern depression treatment. And this is where we start getting into territory that sounds like science fiction, or maybe like conspiracy theories, but it's all real. So stay with me as we venture into the world of brain stimulation, ketamine, psychedelics, and yes, the potential for mind control. If you're still listening, and I hope you are, even if you're drifting in that twilight space between waking and sleeping, I want to ask you to do something. If this deep dive into history is keeping you engaged, if you're learning something, if you appreciate the work that goes into researching and presenting these stories, hit that subscribe button for dreamless timelines. Drop a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me what you think, whether you or someone you know has dealt with depression, what your experience with treatment has been. Your engagement helps us create more content like this, more long-form historical narratives designed for late-night listening. Okay, let's continue into the weird modern stuff. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, sounds like something from Star Trek. You sit in a chair, and a device that looks kind of like a helmet or a giant bug is held against your scalp. This device generates powerful magnetic fields that penetrate through your skull and into your brain. These magnetic pulses stimulate neurons in specific regions associated with mood regulation, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which shows abnormal activity in depressed people. The treatment is painless, no anesthesia needed. You stay awake during it. The most you feel is maybe a tapping sensation on your scalp. You do it 5 days a week for several weeks, and for some people, not everyone, but a significant percentage, it works. Their depression lifts, they function again. The FDA approved TMS for treatment-resistant depression in 2008, and it's been refined and improved since then. There's also vagus nerve stimulation, which is even weirder. The vagus nerve is this long nerve that connects your brain to various organs in your body. It's involved in regulating mood, among other things. So doctors thought, what if we stimulate that nerve? They surgically implant a device in your chest, kind of like a pacemaker, with wires that wrap around the vagus nerve in your neck. The device sends regular electrical pulses to the nerve, which then affects brain regions involved in mood. It was originally developed for epilepsy, but got approved for treatment-resistant depression in 2005. The evidence for its effectiveness is mixed. Some studies show benefit, others don't show much, but some patients swear by it, say it saved their lives when nothing else worked. Then there's deep brain stimulation, or DBS, which is basically a pacemaker for your brain. Surgeons drill holes in your skull and implant electrodes deep in specific brain regions, areas like the subcallosal cingulate or the nucleus accumbens, regions involved in mood regulation and reward processing. These electrodes are connected to a battery pack implanted under the skin of your chest. The device delivers constant electrical stimulation to the targeted brain areas. It sounds like science fiction. It sounds terrifying, but it's real, and it's been used successfully for Parkinson's disease for years. For depression, it's still largely experimental, reserved for the most severe treatment-resistant cases, people who have tried literally everything else without success, people who are actively suicidal and have been for years. The results have been dramatic in some cases. There are documented instances of people who hadn't responded to dozens of medications, years of therapy, multiple rounds of ECT who got DBS and suddenly, within hours or days, felt their depression lift for the first time in decades. It's remarkable. It's also expensive, invasive, and comes with risks like any brain surgery. But here's where things get ethically complicated, where we start edging into mind control territory. Deep brain stimulation involves literally putting electrodes in someone's brain and controlling the electrical activity there. Right now, researchers and doctors are very careful to target only specific regions related to depression. They're trying to treat illness, not control minds. But theoretically, with precise enough targeting, you could potentially alter not just mood, but personality, behavior, maybe even beliefs and values. Could someone use this technology for nefarious purposes? Could governments or corporations use DBS or similar technologies to control people? It sounds paranoid, like conspiracy theory stuff, but these are legitimate concerns that ethicists and neuroscientists have raised. If we can fix depression by altering brain activity, what else can we alter? Where do we draw the line? The CIA certainly thought brain control was possible. From the 1950s through the early 1970s, they ran a program called MKUltra, officially known as the CIA's Program of Research in Behavioral Modification. This was a real thing, not a conspiracy theory. It was exposed in the 1970s and officially acknowledged by the CIA. They were investigating mind control techniques including drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, sexual abuse, and various forms of psychological and physical torture. They gave people LSD without their knowledge to see how it affected them. They studied how to break down someone's personality and rebuild it. They investigated how to induce mental states similar to depression or psychosis. They explored how to control behavior, how to create amnesia, how to make people do things they normally wouldn't do. Much of this research was unethical and illegal, conducted on unwitting subjects including prisoners, mental patients, and just random people drugged without their knowledge. MKUltra was eventually exposed and shut down, the records mostly destroyed, but it left a dark legacy. It showed that intelligence agencies were absolutely interested in understanding and manipulating mental states. And while modern brain stimulation research is, hopefully, conducted ethically, with informed consent and proper oversight, the technology being developed could theoretically be misused. In 2018, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the military's research arm, launched a program called Targeted Neuroplasticity Training. They were investigating whether electrical brain stimulation could be used to enhance learning and skill acquisition in military personnel. Make soldiers learn faster, perform better, by zapping their brains during training. The program was successful enough that it's been continued and expanded. Now, let's be clear, helping people with severe treatment-resistant depression is not the same as mind control. The researchers working on TMS, vagus nerve stimulation, and DBS are trying to alleviate suffering, not control minds. But the technology itself is neutral. It can be used for good or ill, depending on who's using it and why. This is one of those areas where we have to balance potential benefits against potential risks, where we need robust ethical oversight, regulations, and safeguards to prevent misuse. But let's shift gears and talk about something that doesn't involve putting electrodes in people's brains: ketamine. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic that's been used in medicine and veterinary medicine since the 1960s. It's also a club drug, known on the street as Special K, used recreationally for its trippy out-of-body effects. But in the early 2000s, researchers at Yale made an unexpected discovery: ketamine had rapid antidepressant effects. Traditional antidepressants take weeks to start working if they work at all. You take your SSRI every day for 6 weeks before you know if it's going to help. And if it doesn't, you have to wait another 6 weeks to try the next one. For someone in acute crisis, for someone who's suicidal right now, that wait is intolerable. It's dangerous. Ketamine is different. Studies showed that a single infusion of ketamine could reduce depression symptoms within hours. And for people who were actively suicidal, it could reduce suicidal thoughts just as quickly. This was huge. This was potentially life-saving for people in immediate danger. The FDA approved esketamine, a specific form of ketamine, as a nasal spray for treatment-resistant depression in 2019. It's not a first-line treatment. It's expensive. It requires administration in a clinical setting with monitoring for a few hours afterward. But for people who have tried everything else without success, it offers hope. The experience of ketamine treatment is weird, though. At therapeutic doses, it causes dissociation, a feeling of being disconnected from your body or from reality. Some people find this disturbing, uncomfortable, frightening. Others find it therapeutic, like it gives them a break from their normal consciousness and the depression that dominates it. There's also growing interest in whether the dissociative experience itself is part of what makes ketamine effective, or whether it's just a side effect of the chemical changes happening in the brain. And that brings us to psychedelics, which is maybe the weirdest development in modern psychiatry. Psychedelic drugs like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, and MDMA were widely used and studied in the 1950s and 60s. Researchers were exploring their potential for treating various psychiatric conditions. Some of the early results were promising. But then the counterculture movement adopted psychedelics as drugs of liberation and consciousness expansion. Governments freaked out, and by the early 1970s, psychedelics were illegal almost everywhere and research was effectively shut down for decades. Now finally, that research is starting up again. Clinical trials of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression have shown remarkable results. We're talking about people who have been severely depressed for years, who have tried every medication and therapy available, who have been hospitalized multiple times, who have attempted suicide. They take psilocybin in a carefully controlled setting with trained therapists present, have a 6-hour guided trip, and many of them show significant improvement in their depression that lasts for months. Similar results with MDMA for PTSD, with ayahuasca for depression, with other psychedelics. The effects seem to go beyond just the acute experience. People report lasting changes in how they think about themselves and their lives, increased feelings of connection and meaning, reduced rumination, and negative thought patterns. This represents a weird kind of full circle in the history of depression treatment. Ancient cultures used psychoactive plants in healing rituals. Shamans and medicine men facilitated journeys to other realms of consciousness to heal psychological and spiritual ailments. The counterculture of the 1960s experimented with psychedelics and claimed they offered profound psychological insights and healing. Then it all got shut down, demonized, made illegal. Now, 50 years later, mainstream science is rediscovering what shamans and hippies claimed all along. These substances, used carefully and intentionally with proper support, can have therapeutic value. We are still in the early stages of this psychedelic renaissance. The research is ongoing. The FDA is considering approval for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD and psilocybin for depression. There are major questions still to be answered about long-term effects, about who these treatments work best for, about how to integrate them into standard care. But it's exciting, this idea that we might have new tools for treating depression, especially treatment-resistant depression. Let your mind drift for a moment. Think about how far we've come. From drilling holes in skulls and spinning people in chairs to carefully designed medications and therapies. From asylums where people were locked away and forgotten to outpatient treatment where people continue living their lives. From lobotomies to brain stimulation. From punishment to healing. The progress is real, even if it's been slow and messy and marked by terrible mistakes along the way. But depression remains one of the most common and debilitating illnesses in the world. According to the World Health Organization, more than 280 million people globally suffer from depression. It's a leading cause of disability worldwide. Despite all our advances in treatment, we still haven't figured out how to prevent or cure depression for everyone. Part of the problem is that depression isn't one thing. It's a symptom cluster that can arise from multiple causes: genetics, brain chemistry, hormones, inflammation, trauma, chronic stress, medical illness, substance abuse, medications, or some combination of all of these. Two people with identical symptoms might have completely different underlying causes, and what works for one might not work for the other. This is why modern psychiatry emphasizes personalized treatment. It's not one size fits all. It's trial and error, finding what works for each individual. Medication, therapy, brain stimulation, lifestyle changes, social support, often it's a combination of multiple approaches. And sometimes, despite trying everything, nothing works well enough. That's the frustrating reality that clinicians and patients deal with every day. And here's something important that often gets overlooked in discussions of depression treatment. Sometimes depression is a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. If you're living in poverty, if you're dealing with discrimination and oppression, if you're trapped in an abusive relationship, if you're working a soul-crushing job with no way out, if you're dealing with chronic pain or illness, yeah, you're probably going to be depressed. In those cases, medication might help you cope, might give you enough relief to function, but the real solution is changing the situation. This raises broader questions about how we conceptualize mental illness in general. Are we pathologizing normal human responses to a sick society? When we medicate people so they can tolerate intolerable conditions, are we solving the problem or just putting a band-aid on it? When someone is depressed because their life genuinely sucks, is the answer really to change their brain chemistry so they don't mind as much? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. Psychiatrist and philosopher Thomas Schass argued in the 1960s and 70s that mental illness was a myth, that what we call mental illness is really just problems in living, and that psychiatry was a tool of social control, masquerading as medicine. Most people think Schass went too far, but he was pointing at something real. The line between illness and normal human experience is often blurry, and there's a risk of medicalizing normal emotions and behaviors. On the other hand, for someone suffering from severe depression, it doesn't really matter whether their suffering is caused by pure biology or by terrible life circumstances or by some combination. They're suffering either way and they need help. Maybe medication isn't addressing the root cause, but if it provides relief, if it allows someone to function well enough to then address the root causes, that's valuable. It's messy, it's complicated. Welcome to psychiatry. Let's talk about the modern pharmaceutical industry and its relationship with depression treatment, because this is important, and it affects what treatments are available and how they're marketed. Antidepressants are big business, really big business. At their peak before going generic, drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, and Cymbalta were each generating billions of dollars in annual revenue. When there's that much money at stake, incentives get distorted. Pharmaceutical companies are corporations that need to make profits to survive and satisfy shareholders, but they're also responsible for developing and producing medications that people need to survive and function. This creates inherent conflicts of interest. Companies fund most of the research on their own drugs. They design the trials. They analyze the data. They decide what gets published. And there's mountains of evidence showing that industry-funded trials are more likely to show positive results than independent trials. This doesn't necessarily mean the drugs don't work or that the companies are faking data, but it does mean we need to be critical consumers of this research. There's also the issue of publication bias. Studies that show positive results get published in prestigious journals and widely publicized. Studies that show no effect or negative results often get filed away and never published. This skews our overall understanding of how effective these treatments really are. In 2008, researchers analyzed all published and unpublished data on antidepressants submitted to the FDA. They found that 94% of published studies showed positive results, but when you included the unpublished studies, only 51% showed positive results. That's a huge difference. It means the published literature gives a much rosier picture of antidepressant effectiveness than the complete data supports. This doesn't mean antidepressants don't work. The evidence shows they do, especially for severe depression. But the effect sizes are often smaller than what the published literature suggests. For mild to moderate depression, the benefit over placebo is sometimes minimal. Some researchers have argued that antidepressants shouldn't be first-line treatment for mild or moderate depression, that therapy should be tried first. Then there's the question of what happens when patents expire and drugs go generic. Suddenly, pharmaceutical companies lose interest in those drugs. They stop marketing them. They stop funding research on them. Instead, they develop new drugs that are patentable, that they can charge premium prices for. But these new drugs aren't necessarily better than the old ones. They're just different enough to get a new patent. This is the reality of for-profit medicine. Companies need to make money to fund research and development. But when profit becomes the primary motive, when quarterly earnings matter more than patient welfare, the system gets distorted. It's a deep structural problem without easy solutions. There's also been a massive expansion in what we consider treatable with antidepressants. These drugs are now prescribed not just for major depressive disorder, but for anxiety disorders, panic disorder, OCD, PTSD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, and a bunch of other conditions. Some of these uses are evidence-based and appropriate. Others are more questionable, based on limited evidence or aggressive marketing rather than solid science. And doctors, especially primary care physicians who prescribe the majority of antidepressants, often don't have time for thorough evaluation. A 15-minute appointment isn't enough to really understand what's going on with a patient, so they rely on brief screening questionnaires and the patient's self-report. If someone says they're sad and can't sleep, they often walk out with a prescription for an SSRI. Again, this isn't necessarily bad. For many people, it's helpful. But it does mean we're probably over-medicating to some extent, treating people who might benefit more from therapy, from addressing the life circumstances causing their distress, from social support and lifestyle changes rather than medication. Before we go any further, I want to pause and acknowledge something. If you're still listening to this, if you've made it this far through this long, winding journey through the history of depression, you're amazing. This is a lot of information, a lot of darkness, a lot of complexity. And I hope it's helping you drift off peacefully, letting your conscious mind engage just enough to follow the story while your body relaxes into sleep. If you're getting something out of this, please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. Hit that like button, leave a comment. Your support helps us create more content like this, more deep historical dives designed for late-night listening. We're trying to build something special here, educational content that's also conducive to rest, stories that engage your mind while calming your body. All right, let's continue. Now let's talk about the digital age, and how it's changed depression in ways nobody anticipated. Social media launched in the early 2000s with platforms like Friendster and MySpace, then exploded with Facebook in the mid-2000s. At first, it seemed great. Connection, community, sharing your life with friends and family. But as the platforms matured and became ubiquitous, as smartphones made them accessible 24/7, darker patterns emerged. Studies started showing correlations between social media use and depression, especially among teenagers and young adults. The more time people spent on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and later TikTok and Snapchat, the more likely they were to report symptoms of depression and anxiety. There are multiple theories about why. Social comparison is a big one. You're scrolling through your feed, seeing everyone else's highlight reels, their vacations, their perfect relationships, their achievements, their attractive photos, and comparing that to your behind-the-scenes reality. It's a rigged game. You're comparing your messy, complicated, often boring life to everyone else's carefully curated public image. And you know intellectually that what you're seeing isn't real, that everyone else is also curating their image, but emotionally it still affects you. You still feel like everyone else is doing better than you. Then there's FOMO, fear of missing out, seeing everyone else having fun without you, attending parties and events you weren't invited to, living lives that seem more exciting than yours. It's like being back in middle school, but on a global scale, 24/7, with no escape. The platforms themselves are designed to be addictive. They exploit our psychological vulnerabilities, our need for social validation, our curiosity, our tendency to seek novel stimulation. Every like, every comment, every notification triggers a little dopamine hit in your brain, but between those hits, you're left in a dopamine deficit, feeling worse than before. So you check again, hopping for another hit. It's a cycle that keeps you scrolling, keeps you engaged, keeps you on the platform so they can sell ads. And the content itself has gotten darker. The algorithms optimize for engagement and what engages people. Outrage, fear, conflict, extremism. Content that provokes strong emotional reactions gets amplified because strong reactions mean engagement, mean time on platform, mean ad revenue. So your feed becomes this toxic stew of bad news, arguments, and anxiety-inducing content. For someone already prone to depression, this is like pouring gasoline on a fire. You're already dealing with negative thought patterns, low self-esteem, difficulty finding pleasure. Then you spend hours every day scrolling through content specifically designed to trigger negative emotions and make you feel inadequate. It's terrible. But here's the twisted part. Social media can also be a lifeline for people with depression. Online communities provide support, understanding, and connection that people might not find in their physical lives. People share their struggles, offer advice, remind each other they're not alone. Mental health advocacy on social media has probably done more to reduce stigma than decades of public health campaigns. People are talking openly about depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. So is social media making depression worse, or is it helping? The answer is yes, both. It depends on how you use it, what you engage with, how much time you spend on it, what your relationship with it is like. The COVID-19 pandemic threw all of this into sharp relief. Suddenly, in March 2020, the world shut down. People were isolated at home, and digital connection became the only connection for many people. Mental health statistics went through the roof. Depression rates doubled or tripled in many countries. Anxiety skyrocketed. Substance abuse increased. Suicide rates fluctuated in complex ways, increasing in some demographics and locations, while staying stable or even decreasing in others. The pandemic was a massive collective trauma. People lost loved ones, sometimes unable to be with them as they died, unable to have proper funerals or memorial services. People lost jobs, businesses, homes. The economic devastation was staggering. Healthcare workers dealt with impossible situations, watching people die in unprecedented numbers while facing shortages of basic protective equipment, working double shifts for months on end, developing PTSD from the sheer scale of death and suffering they witnessed. Essential workers, grocery store clerks, delivery drivers, warehouse workers, risked their lives for minimum wage while being called heroes but not actually treated like heroes. Everyone dealt with uncertainty, fear, isolation. The social fabric frayed. Political polarization intensified. Conspiracy theories flourished. It was a perfect storm for mental health deterioration. And our mental health infrastructure was completely overwhelmed. Therapists' caseloads exploded. Everyone needed help at the same time. Psychiatric hospitals filled up. Crisis hotlines were swamped with calls. People waited months for appointments. Psychiatrists were booked solid. The system, which was already strained before the pandemic, nearly broke under the pressure. This exposed something important. We've been treating mental health as an individual problem, something to be fixed with individual treatments. But maybe depression is also, sometimes primarily, a social problem. When social bonds fray, when communities disintegrate, when economic inequality creates massive stress, when the future looks bleak, of course people are going to be depressed. You can't therapy or medicate your way out of a sick society. This isn't a new insight, by the way. Socialist and communist movements in the 19th and 20th centuries argued that mental illness was largely a product of capitalist alienation and exploitation. Workers were alienated from the products of their labor, from their own humanity, from each other. Fix the social conditions, they said, build a society based on cooperation rather than competition, and you'd fix the mental health crisis. Obviously, this didn't work out as planned. Communist countries had plenty of mental illness, and the cure often proved worse than the disease. But they weren't entirely wrong about the connection between social conditions and mental health. Modern research backs this up. Countries with stronger social safety nets, better healthcare access, less economic inequality, and more community cohesion tend to have lower rates of depression. It's not just about individual brain chemistry. It's about the whole context in which people live their lives. It's about whether you feel secure or precarious, connected or isolated, hopeful or hopeless about the future. So what do we do with this information? How do we address depression at both the individual and societal level? There are no easy answers. I wish I could give you a simple solution, a clear path forward, but this is complex, and anyone who offers simple solutions is probably selling something. Still, there are some directions that seem promising. At the individual level, we need better access to treatment. Mental health parity laws require insurance companies to cover mental health treatment the same as physical health treatment, but enforcement is spotty at best. Therapy is expensive and often not covered adequately. Medications can be expensive too, especially newer ones. Poor people who are at higher risk for depression in the first place due to the stress of poverty often have the least access to treatment. That's backwards. We need more therapists, especially in rural and underserved areas where you might have to drive hours to see someone. We need to train primary care doctors to better recognize and treat mental illness, since they're often the first point of contact. We need to integrate mental health care into regular medical care instead of treating it as this separate, stigmatized thing you have to seek out separately. We need to continue developing new treatments. The psychedelic research is promising. The brain stimulation technologies are promising. The work on inflammation and the gut-brain connection is promising. But we need to make sure these treatments are accessible and affordable, not just available to wealthy people who can pay out of pocket. We need to be more critical consumers of research, especially industry-funded research. We need independent studies, we need long-term follow-up data, we need honest discussions of side effects and limitations. We need to acknowledge when we don't know things instead of pretending we have all the answers. At the societal level, we need to address the structural factors that contribute to depression: economic insecurity, massive inequality, social isolation, environmental degradation, political polarization, the erosion of community. These aren't just mental health issues, they're societal issues with mental health consequences. We need to rebuild communities, create spaces for genuine human connection outside of digital platforms. We need to reform work culture. The grind culture that glorifies overwork and burnout is literally making people sick. We need to address social media's role in mental health, probably through regulation, though that's complicated and fraught with concerns about free speech and government overreach. We need to keep talking about depression, keep reducing stigma, keep normalizing the reality that mental illness is common and treatable. Every time someone speaks openly about their struggles, it makes it a little easier for the next person to do the same. Let me shift gears and tell you some more personal stories, because history isn't just about broad trends and scientific developments. It's about individual human experiences, real people who dealt with this darkness in different ways. David Foster Wallace was a brilliant writer, author of Infinite Jest and numerous other acclaimed works. He was also one of the best writers about depression, able to articulate the experience in ways that made people who'd never been depressed understand, and made people who had been depressed feel seen and understood. Wallace struggled with severe depression for most of his adult life. He tried multiple medications. He tried therapy with multiple therapists. He tried ECT repeatedly. Sometimes treatments would work for a while, give him some relief, allow him to write and teach and function. Then they'd stop working and he'd sink back into the darkness. In 2008, after changing medications triggered a severe depressive episode, he died by suicide at age 46. Wallace wrote about depression with devastating clarity. He described it as a kind of psychic pain so severe that it makes physical torture seem preferable. In an unfinished novel found after his death, he wrote about the difference between physical pain and the pain of severe depression. With physical pain, you can at least understand it, describe it, know that others have experienced similar pain. But the pain of depression is isolating, incommunicable, a darkness that swallows everything. He also wrote about suicidal thinking in ways that help people understand why someone would choose to die. The so-called psychotically depressed person who tries to kill herself, he wrote, doesn't do so out of, quote, hopelessness, or any abstract conviction that life's assets and debits do not square, and surely not because death seems suddenly appealing. The person in whom its invisible agony reaches a certain unendurable level will kill herself the same way a trapped person will eventually jump from the window of a burning high-rise. Think about that image as you're drifting off. You're in a burning building. The flames are at your back, intense heat, smoke filling your lungs. You're at a window on the 80th floor. You know that jumping will kill you, but staying means burning alive. So you jump, not because you want to die, but because the pain of staying has become unendurable. That's what severe depression feels like to someone experiencing it. Not a rational choice between living and dying, but a desperate attempt to escape unbearable pain. Wallace's death was a tragedy. He had so much more to write, to teach, to give to the world. But his willingness to write about depression so honestly, to articulate the inarticulate, has helped countless people understand their own experiences or the experiences of people they love. His words have reduced stigma, increased understanding, maybe even saved lives. Let me tell you about Kitty Dukakis, wife of former presidential candidate Michael Dukakis. She struggled with depression for decades, tried dozens of medications, multiple therapists, numerous hospitalizations. Nothing worked long-term. She'd get some relief, then sink back down. The medications would stop working or the side effects would become intolerable. She was treatment-resistant, one of those unlucky people for whom nothing seems to help. Finally, in her 70s, desperate and running out of options, she tried ECT, modern ECT done properly with anesthesia and muscle relaxants, and it worked. For the first time in decades, she felt relief from the depression that had dominated her life. She's been receiving maintenance ECT treatments for years now and credits it with saving her life. Her story is important because it shows that ECT, despite its horrific history and scary reputation, genuinely helps some people when nothing else does. It's not the barbaric procedure it once was. Modern ECT is carefully controlled, relatively safe and effective for many people with treatment-resistant depression. Yes, it can cause memory problems, usually temporary but sometimes lasting. Yes, it's not pleasant even with anesthesia. But for people like Dukakis who have tried everything else without success, it can be life-saving. Let me tell you about Marsha Linehan, the psychologist who developed dialectical behavior therapy. For decades, she was known as a brilliant researcher and clinician who had developed innovative treatments for borderline personality disorder and chronic suicidality. Her therapy, DBT, has helped thousands of people learn to manage intense emotions, reduce self-harm, build lives worth living. What people didn't know was that Linehan herself had been hospitalized as a teenager for severe mental illness. She'd spent years in psychiatric institutions in the 1960s, had engaged in serious self-harm, had made multiple suicide attempts. She'd been locked in seclusion rooms, restrained, heavily medicated. She'd been told she would never have a normal life, would probably be institutionalized forever. But she got out, she got better slowly and with great difficulty. She went to college, got a PhD, became a professor and researcher. And she developed DBT partly based on her own experiences, on what had helped her and what hadn't. She revealed this publicly in 2011, when she was in her 60s and well established in her career. Her reasoning was that she wanted people to know that recovery was possible, that someone could go from being a severely ill psychiatric patient to becoming a leading expert in the field. Linehan's story illustrates something crucial. Having mental illness doesn't preclude you from having a meaningful, productive, even exceptional life. You're not broken beyond repair. You're not a lost cause. You're dealing with a medical condition that requires treatment and ongoing management, but that doesn't define your potential or your worth as a human being. These individual stories matter. They put human faces on the statistics. Depression affects over 280 million people globally. That's 280 million individual human experiences, 280 million unique stories of suffering and struggle, resilience and recovery, or sometimes tragedy. Every single person who has ever dealt with depression is part of this larger history we're exploring. Your experience, or your loved one's experience, connects to this centuries-long human struggle to understand and address this condition. You're not alone, you never have been. Throughout all of human history, people have grappled with this same darkness, and many of them have found their way back to the light. Now let's talk about some of the cutting-edge research happening right now, because the story of depression treatment isn't over. Scientists and clinicians are working on new approaches that might revolutionize treatment in the coming decades. Some of this stuff sounds like science fiction, but it's real, happening in labs and clinics around the world. There's research into using artificial intelligence and machine learning to predict who will respond to which treatments. Researchers are feeding huge amounts of data into algorithms, genetic data, brain scan data, clinical symptom data, treatment response data from thousands of patients. The AI analyzes patterns that human researchers might miss, looking for signatures that predict treatment response. The goal is to eventually be able to do genetic testing and brain imaging on a depressed patient and say with high confidence, "You'll respond well to this SSRI, but not that one. You're a good candidate for TMS. You should try therapy before medication." Personalized medicine based on your unique biological and psychological profile. There's research into the role of inflammation in depression. It turns out that chronic inflammation, which can be caused by various factors including diet, stress, infections, autoimmune conditions, and obesity, is strongly linked to depression. Some researchers believe that a significant subset of depression cases are essentially inflammatory conditions. If that's true, then treating the inflammation might treat the depression. Studies are looking at anti-inflammatory medications, dietary interventions, and lifestyle changes aimed at reducing inflammation. There's fascinating research into the gut-brain connection. Your gut contains trillions of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi that make up your microbiome. These organisms produce neurotransmitters, including serotonin. In fact, about 90% of your body's serotonin is produced in your gut, not your brain. The gut and brain communicate via the vagus nerve and through chemical signals in the bloodstream. Disruptions in gut health have been linked to depression and anxiety. Studies are investigating whether probiotics, prebiotics, and dietary interventions aimed at improving gut health can treat depression. Some early results are promising. It sounds crazy, treating depression with yogurt and fiber, but the science is solid. The gut-brain axis is real, and it affects mental health in ways we're only beginning to understand. There's genetic research trying to identify specific genes that increase depression risk. Large-scale genome-wide association studies have identified hundreds of genetic variants associated with depression. None of them has a huge effect individually, but collectively they paint a picture of the biological pathways involved. This could eventually lead to better treatments targeting those pathways. It could also lead to genetic testing to identify at-risk individuals and target prevention efforts, though that raises ethical concerns about genetic discrimination. There's neuroscience research using advanced brain imaging to better understand what's actually happening in the brains of depressed people. Different subtypes of depression show different patterns of brain activity and connectivity. Some people have too much activity in certain regions, others have too little. Some have disrupted connections between regions. This could lead to better classification systems and more targeted treatments. Maybe instead of saying you have depression, we'll say you have hyperactive default mode network depression, or you have hypoconnected frontal limbic depression, and the treatment will be specifically targeted to that pattern. There's research into rapid-acting antidepressants beyond ketamine. Scientists are trying to develop medications that provide the quick relief of ketamine without the dissociative effects, the abuse potential, or the need for clinical administration. Several compounds are in various stages of development and testing. There's continued research into psychedelic therapy, with large-scale clinical trials of psilocybin, MDMA, and other substances ongoing. These studies are showing that these substances, combined with psychotherapy in carefully controlled settings, can produce significant and lasting improvements in depression, PTSD, anxiety, and addiction. We're getting closer to FDA approval for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD and psilocybin for depression. This could represent a major shift in how we treat mental illness. There's research into lifestyle interventions, exercise, diet, sleep, social connection. While these aren't replacements for medical treatment in severe cases, there's growing evidence that lifestyle factors play a huge role in both the development and treatment of depression. Regular exercise can be as effective as medication for mild to moderate depression. Getting adequate sleep is crucial. Having strong social connections is protective. Eating a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, omega-3 fatty acids, and whole grains while low in processed foods and sugar is associated with lower depression rates. Some researchers are advocating for what they call lifestyle medicine as a first-line treatment for mild depression, reserving medication for moderate to severe cases, or when lifestyle interventions alone aren't sufficient. This makes sense from a public health perspective, but it also risks downplaying the severity of depression and suggesting that people just need to exercise more and eat better, which can feel dismissive to people who are genuinely suffering. All of this research is ongoing. Some of it will pan out, some won't. But the point is that we are continuing to push forward, continuing to try to understand and treat depression more effectively. The work continues. And that brings us to where we are now, in 2026. Depression remains one of the most common and debilitating mental health conditions worldwide. The COVID-19 pandemic's mental health effects are still reverberating through populations. Economic uncertainty, climate anxiety, political polarization, social media addiction, loneliness epidemics, all of these contemporary factors contribute to rising rates of depression, especially among young people. But we also have more tools than ever before to address it. More treatment options, better understanding, reduced stigma, greater awareness, conversations happening in mainstream media and on social platforms that would have been unthinkable even 20 years ago. It's not enough, not yet. Too many people are still suffering. Too many people don't have access to treatment. Too many people don't respond to available treatments. But it's something, it's progress. If there's a lesson from this long, complicated history, it's this: we've made progress. Slow, messy, often brutal progress marked by terrible mistakes and horrific treatments, but progress nonetheless. We went from locking people away and torturing them in the name of treatment to actually helping many people recover and live full lives. That's significant. That matters. We've also learned that there are no magic bullets, no simple solutions. Depression is complex, multifaceted, individual. What works for one person might not work for another. Treatment often requires patience, persistence, willingness to try different approaches. It's frustrating, but that's the reality we're working with. We've learned that depression is both a biological reality and a social phenomenon. You can't separate the individual brain from the social context it exists in. This means effective treatment often requires addressing both medical and therapeutic interventions for the individual, and social and political changes to address the conditions that contribute to depression on a population level. We've learned that stigma kills. For most of human history, people with depression were ashamed, hidden, blamed for their condition. That's changing slowly but steadily. The more we talk openly about depression, the more we normalize it as a common medical condition, the more people feel comfortable seeking help. Every person who speaks publicly about their struggles makes it easier for others to do the same. We've learned that hope matters. Even when depression makes hope feel impossible, even when everything seems dark and pointless, holding on to the possibility that things can get better is crucial. And for most people, things do get better eventually, with proper treatment and support. Where do we go from here? What's the future of depression treatment? Honestly, nobody knows for sure, but there are some possibilities worth considering as you drift into sleep. Maybe we'll develop a blood test or brain scan that can diagnose depression objectively and identify which treatment will work best for each person. No more trial and error, no more months or years of trying different medications hoping one will work. Just, you have this subtype of depression based on these biomarkers, this treatment will work, here you go. That would be huge. Maybe we'll develop new medications that work faster, more effectively, with fewer side effects. Or maybe we'll move beyond medications entirely to other forms of treatment. Targeted brain stimulation that you can do at home, genetic therapies that address underlying vulnerabilities, immunotherapies that target inflammation, or things we haven't even thought of yet. Maybe we'll figure out how to prevent depression in the first place, identifying at-risk individuals early and intervening before they develop full-blown illness. This could involve everything from genetic interventions to childhood mental health programs to social policy changes that address poverty, inequality, and social isolation. Maybe we'll build a society that's less conducive to depression, more community connection, less economic insecurity, better work-life balance, healthier relationships with technology. This is probably the hardest change to make, requiring massive social and economic shifts, but potentially the most impactful. Or maybe, and this might be the most realistic possibility, we'll continue muddling through with incremental improvements. A new medication here, a refined therapy technique there, slowly expanding access to treatment, gradually reducing stigma. Not a revolution, but steady evolution. Not perfect, but better than what came before. Whatever happens, the work continues. Researchers keep researching. Clinicians keep treating patients. Patients keep struggling and recovering and sometimes relapsing and struggling again. And all of us, as a society, keep trying to figure out how to reduce suffering and promote well-being. That's where the story stands now. Not finished, not resolved, but ongoing. And you're part of that story, whether you realize it or not. If you've dealt with depression yourself, if you've supported someone who has, if you're a clinician or researcher working on these issues, if you're just someone trying to understand, you're part of this long human project of figuring out how to live with and address this condition. I want to end by coming back to that fundamental human experience of depression, stripped of all the medical terminology and treatment modalities and historical context. What is it actually like to be in that darkness? It's waking up and feeling like there's a weight on your chest, making it hard to breathe. It's going through the motions of your day while feeling fundamentally disconnected from everything around you, like you're watching your life through thick glass. Unable to really touch or feel anything. It's the exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, the sadness that has no clear cause, the inability to feel pleasure even from things you used to love. It's the negative thoughts that loop endlessly in your mind, telling you that you're worthless, that everything is hopeless, that it will never get better, that you're a burden to everyone around you. It's the isolation because you don't have the energy to reach out to people, and anyway you're convinced they don't really want to hear from you, that they're just being polite, that you're bothering them. It's the physical symptoms that people don't always talk about, the headaches, the stomach aches, the chronic pain that seems to have no physical cause. It's the changes in appetite, either eating too much or being unable to eat at all. It's the sleep problems, either insomnia, lying awake at 3 a.m. with your mind racing, or sleeping too much, sleeping 12 or 14 hours but never feeling rested. It's the way time seems to distort, hours crawling by when you're in the depths of it, days blurring together into an indistinguishable grey mass. It's the loss of hope, the inability to imagine a future that doesn't feel like this, the sense that you'll be trapped in this darkness forever. It's the scary thoughts that creep in when things get really bad, thoughts about not existing, about the world being better off without you, about ways you could make the pain stop. Thoughts you're ashamed of and afraid of but can't seem to stop having. But here's what else it is, and this is important. It's survivable, it's treatable, it's not permanent, even when it feels like it is. Millions of people have experienced what I just described and have made it through to the other side. Treatment works for most people, eventually. Sometimes it takes a while to find the right treatment or combination of treatments. Sometimes it's a long, difficult process, but most people with depression can and do get better. That woman in Ward 17 back in 1887, sitting motionless in her darkness with no effective treatment available. Today, she'd have options. She'd have hope. She'd have a real chance at recovery. She might try an SSRI first, maybe combined with cognitive behavioral therapy. If that didn't work, she could try a different medication, try TMS, try ketamine. She'd have therapists who actually understood depression, who could teach her skills to manage her symptoms and challenge her negative thoughts. She'd live in a society where depression was recognized as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. That's the progress we've made. That's what centuries of research and clinical experience, and yes, even those barbaric early treatments, have led to. We're not there yet. We haven't solved depression. We haven't eliminated the suffering, but we've come a long way and the journey continues. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body sinking into your mattress. We're coming to the end of this journey, this long exploration of depression through history. If you're dealing with depression right now, as you're listening to this, know that you're not alone. You're part of a long lineage of people who have faced this darkness and survived. Many of them found treatment that helped. Many of them built lives worth living despite their depression, or even because of what they learned from wrestling with it. There's no shame in seeking help. There's no shame in taking medication if that's what helps you. There's no shame in trying different treatments until you find what works. The shame belongs to the historical ignorance and cruelty that characterized so much of depression treatment in the past. We've left most of that behind now. We're in a better place, even if it's not perfect. Keep talking about what you're experiencing. Keep seeking treatment. Keep holding on through the dark nights, because the darkness doesn't last forever, even when it feels like it will. And for those of you listening who don't have depression, who are just here for the history and to help yourselves drift off to sleep, I hope this has given you some understanding and compassion for those who do struggle with it. Depression isn't a choice. Nobody would choose to feel that way. It's not weakness or self-indulgence or attention-seeking. It's a medical condition that causes real suffering. If someone in your life is dealing with depression, the best thing you can do is be patient, be supportive. Believe them when they tell you how they feel, even if their feelings don't make logical sense to you. Encourage them to seek professional help. Don't try to fix them or cheer them up with platitudes. Just be there, just listen. Just remind them that they're not alone and that you care. We've covered a lot of ground in this journey, from ancient Greek theories of black bile to medieval spiritual interpretations, from horrific asylum conditions to lobotomies and electroshock, from the accidental discovery of the first antidepressants to Prozac and the SSRI revolution, from Freudian psychoanalysis to evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy, from social media's impact to the COVID pandemic's mental health crisis, from cutting-edge brain stimulation to psychedelic therapy research. It's been a complicated story without a neat ending because we're still living it. We're still figuring out what depression is and how to treat it. We're still dealing with the consequences of past mistakes and trying to avoid new ones. We're still balancing individual treatment with broader social change. Before I let you drift completely into sleep, I want to share one more thing. It's a quote from Andrew Solomon, who wrote a remarkable book about depression called The Noonday Demon. He said, "The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality." Think about that for a moment. Depression isn't just about being sad. It's about the absence of vitality, of energy, of the ability to fully engage with life. And recovery isn't about being happy all the time. Nobody's happy all the time, and that's okay. It's about reclaiming your vitality, your capacity to feel and experience and engage, both the good and the bad. That's what treatment aims to restore. Not perpetual happiness, but the ability to fully live, to feel the full range of human emotions, to engage with life even when it's difficult. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember, the sun rises even after the longest night. The darkness doesn't last forever. Tomorrow is another day, another chance, another opportunity for things to be different. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complete history of depression. Thank you for listening, for engaging, for staying with me through all the darkness and complexity. If this resonated with you, if you learned something, if it helped you understand depression better or helped you drift off to sleep, please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. Hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own experiences. Your support helps us create more content like this. This has been the complete history of depression, from asylum to Prozac and mind control. A journey through centuries of human suffering and progress, of ignorance and understanding, of cruelty and compassion, of darkness and hope. May you rest well, may your dreams be gentle, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed strength to face whatever challenges lie ahead. Good night.